steps, promoting patient safety, improving health.
Good.
Hi, I'm Adam Hoffman of West Virginia STEPS at West Virginia University. This is our Respiratory Human Function Laboratory experience. It was originally designed for first-year medical students. This experience has been adapted for our ICU staff. Special thanks to our 3 participants, Shelly, Shannon, and Paige, for their excellent work in this video. All right, would everybody like the same roles, or would you like to do something different this time?
You want to do something?
Reading, writing, and playing with the...
Perfect.
Okay, so this is the respiratory version of human function. So, Paige, if you would, I'll let you.
In your
take this
first
away.
human function laboratory experience, you met Stanley Ardman. At that time, Stanley had suffered a motorcycle accident. You probably remember constructing a Starling curve as part of your exercise to understand how Stanley's cardiovascular system functioned. At that time, Stanley was in the emergency department. He has been transferred to the intensive care unit. Stanley has been in the hospital and has continued to be ventilated. Today, we are going to demonstrate some of the respiratory principles pertinent to Stanley's care. You're in the intensive care unit. Stanley Ardman is a healthy 25-year-old man who weighs 80 kilograms. He takes no medications and has no allergies to medications. He has had no health issues prior to his motorcycle accident. Overall objectives: to provide the student with a deeper understanding of ventilator parameters, to provide the student with a deeper understanding of basic respiratory principles by providing applied exercises combined with discussion. Part 1. Introduction to monitoring and normal parameters. To become aware of the monitored values, emphasizing the respiratory variables. To become aware of which values indicate that the patient is in distress. To understand that the ventilator settings affect many variables. To become aware that some values are measured and others are derived. Stanley's hypovolemia has been corrected with low administration, and he has undergone an exploratory laparotomy to gain control of his bleeding. He has just arrived in the intensive care unit and is currently being ventilated via bag valve. We need to establish Stanley's baseline vent settings. What ventilator strategy should we use?
So, you guys ever heard the term vent strategy? You probably have, but probably never termed this way. So, have you ever heard of like protective lung ventilation? Right? So, it's a vent strategy, right? So, we have like protective lung, that would be one vent strategy. What would be another vent strategy?
I guess you're just saying like low settings to achieve.
Yeah, so that would be like protective lung.
Right,
Then there's such a
okay.
thing as like normal, right?
Right.
Like there can be a normal vent strategy where
Yeah.
like we're putting them on the ventilator for other reasons. Right?
Okay.
And then you might even have something like an expansion volume strategy. I think asthma, where you're going to go the opposite of protective lung. You want higher tidal volumes, longer ID times, right? Right, because of that obstructive process, right? So, what do you think would be a good strategy for Stanley?
So.
No real lung disease, right?
Right.
So,
Low.
pretty normal, right?
Yeah, pretty normal.
So we write up there. What kind of things would go into? What do we need to pick for a normal vent strategy? What kind of things do we need to know? We need
Right.
a rate. We need a rate.
Tidal volume.
Yep. We need a tidal volume. So what would be a normal tidal volume?
For 4 to 600, like probably more towards the middle 500-ish.
Okay. So make it what like make that more silent. What's the range? What would be a good range you could go off of? You're right. You're right. Your numbers are
Yeah.
right. But where'd
Yeah.
you get those?
I mean, in Pete's world, we go by
Weight per
volume per
kilogram.
kilo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's cc's per kilo what
Right.
of predictive or ideal body weight.
Ideal
Do you know
body
we
weight.
can't call it ideal body weight anymore? It's predictive body weight now.
Oh.
Really?
Because no patients aren't ideal. Okay,
Oh.
so
Jeez.
I did not know that.
right, predictive body weight. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the new trend,
That's
right?
ideal.
Can you believe that? Okay, so but it's per kilo of ideal body weight because
Okay.
people don't have bigger lungs.
Okay.
Okay, so what would that be for normal?
For an adult, 7 per kilo.
Yeah,
8 per
six to
kilo.
eight. Yeah, 6 to 8 usually. Yeah. So what would a 6 to 8 for Stanley be?
He's
Give
8
us a range
kilos.
here.
He's 80 kilograms. Or of his predictive body weight, but I don't know how tall he
560.
is.
He's normal. 80 is appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah, so 480 to 560.
Yeah.
So your numbers were perfect, Shannon. But yeah, that's where we come up with that, right? And a rate, what would a normal rate be?
12 to 16.
Yeah, 12 to 20, yeah, somewhere in there. Okay. What else do we need to know? We're gonna put him on the vent.
FiO2.
Yeah, we need to pick an FiO2. Okay. And what else?
PEEP.
We need a PEEP.
And depending on mode support.
Yeah. So we need a mode. We need a mode. Let's pick. We're gonna have to pick a mode, right?
Yep.
So what would be a normal PEEP?
Uh,
5. Okay. So what is PEEP?
Positive end expiratory pressure.
Okay. And why do I care? What is PEEP?
Uh,
What is it doing for us?
it's it helps to oxygenate and keep the lungs from collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. So PEEP is that air pressure left in at the end of expiration, right? And it directly tied to oxygenation, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But what about is there what like why do we have to add that much? Is it something we normally have?
To overcome the two. The
Yeah. So do you have that? Do we have PEEP?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is our PEEP?
It's 5-ish.
5. Yeah.
Probably
Okay.
normal,
And what
yeah.
gives us PEEP?
Just breathing out against our airway, I imagine.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, absolutely, right? All those upper airway structures,
Yep.
from the vocal cords and the epiglottis, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, all that gives us a little bit of PEEP. Can it be artificially high in patients?
Yes.
Who would have
Obstructions,
high PEEP?
asthma.
So asthma's a big one, yeah, sure. What about normally? Some patients have more PEEP that are in a crisis setting like asthma.
I guess I don't know, someone that would have restriction with, say, like a tumor or something against the airway.
Could be, but even more common than that.
Uh,
You ever heard of somebody in auto peeping?
Mhm.
Who auto peeps?
Like COPD or.
COPD is a great example. Yeah, pink puffers, right? That blown against pursed lips, that's a generating PEEP and auto peep strategy, right? So perfect. Okay. All right, so we're gonna have to pick a mode, and then there'll be maybe something else that goes with that, right? I think we pretty well have everything figured out there, right? Okay.
Yep.
So, Janice, your big moment here. Let's hit that top left corner where it says volume control there. Let's open up the mode screen. Okay. All right. So, oh yeah, open up modes there. All right. So let's talk about each of these in turn. So we're gonna have to pick a mode. So let's talk about each one. What is volume control?
it is a set volume, set rate, set PEEP, set FiO2.
Pressure just varies.
Yeah.
Yep. So, right, this is just physics. You have volume and pressure, and you can choose to control one. The other one has to be a variable. So, in that case, we're choosing to control the volume, which means obviously the pressure then has to be variable. What's the advantages to putting a patient on volume control?
Knowing exactly how much air you're giving, how much volume at any given point.
Sure, absolutely. And what kind of patients would you put on volume control?
Normal, healthy lungs.
Yeah. What's one other advantage?
Of volume control. I guess I'm just going back to what I was saying. Yes, it's just safer because you know how much you're giving at every point. But like, what's? I guess I'm not.
Yeah. So, and I would contend that one advantage of volume control is the vents doing all the work.
Oh, okay.
So this is ideal for a patient
Okay.
where we want the vent to do all the work. Right? We're gonna rest in the lungs, and the vent's gonna take over, and it's just gonna do it. Right?
Gotcha.
What's the disadvantage of volume control? Otherwise known as assist control, right? If there is such a thing as true assist control now, which probably isn't.
There's
You
no
just have to
SIMB.
monitor your.
Yeah, yeah. And what happens if the patient triggers a breath?
There's no help. Or
Well, it'll give them a breath.
but
But you're getting the whole thing, aren't you?
Yeah,
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 exactly,
okay,
exactly.
yeah.
So it can be kind of dangerous if the patient is breath trapping, right?
I guess
So
no support is
if
fine.
they air trap or if they start breathing over a vent, they're going to get, if we set that at 560,
Yeah.
if he hiccups, he's getting 560. And if he goes on a hiccup and spasm, he's going to get 560 a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the one downside with volume control is that it's not super comfortable mode of ventilation. Because if the patient triggers a breath, and they should be able to trigger a breath, but they're getting the whole thing. They're not going to get a little baby breath. And most of us don't breathe 560 12 times a minute. That's just not how most of us breathe, right? But there's some advantages to volume control. So let's convert that with the next one on there.
Pressure control.
So what is pressure control?
You have a set pressure with a variance of volume.
Yeah.
Set rate, set PEEP, set FI2, but your volumes are going to vary
The volumes may change.
according to compliance.
So we're choosing to control the pressure instead of the volume.
Yeah.
Great. So what are some advantages to pressure control?
Advantages.
Patients that you're having issues with their pressures, like trying to think of a specific type of patients, but a good bit of patients that you have to, their pressure's too high to give them the volume that you need. You have to set the pressure in order to get a better volume. It's easier to manage.
So if
them
you start
without
getting up
causing
into dangerous
issues.
pressure territory
Yeah.
with unhealthy lungs,
Yes.
right? Yeah, then that is a little more protective, right? Because
Yeah.
then they're not going to get 560 of volume if they air trap. They're only
Right.
going to get that. So when you start getting up there north at some of those pressures, that's a little safer motivating. What else is it? What is another good time to use it? There's one unit in the hospital that uses pressure control a lot.
Don't look at me.
No. I was going to say because I don't do
It's in
adult.
your
It's
neighborhood.
been a long time
No,
since I've
it's
done
in your
adult.
neighborhood.
It's in our.
It's on your neighborhood.
We
Yeah.
use pressure control?
Nick
Oh,
NICU
NICU.
uses pressure
Yeah.
control a lot.
Yeah,
Why?
I was
Why do you think
thinking
NICU
more.
does?
There are a lot of the, at least the
Chronic lungs.
yes,
they
their
use-
compliance is awful.
So sometimes they have compliance issues, and neonate, how fast should they breathe? Not 12,
No.
right? So when you get up there in those higher rates, if they air trap a breath on volume control, they're in trouble,
Yeah.
right? So when you start getting into rates in the 40s, pressure control is a better mode of ventilation because it's safer. You're never going to be able to catch an air trapping infant at a rate of 40. They're just not going to have that isolation time. So pressure control is a little safer in those patients, and that's why NICU uses it a lot. They got stiff lungs oftentimes in a lot of these really small babies. They're running higher rates. They're oftentimes running a little higher pressures, and so they use pressure control a good bit. Where we don't see it that often, even in the peds world, but certainly not in the adult world either. We really don't use that necessarily. We tend to go more with the volume control underlying mode, right? Yeah, at least an underlying volume control and an underlying pressure control, even in our SID. So what was the next mode on there? Let's go back to the modes there.
PRVC.
So what's PRVC?
Pressure regulated volume control.
And why would I use PRVC?
Someone that has compliance issues, it adjusts the pressure to achieve a volume.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that is a little, it's still an underlying volume control, right? But a little safer flavor of volume control so we don't blow anybody's lungs up with repeated 560 breaths, right? Okay. What's the next one?
Pressure support CPAP.
Okay, so tell me about pressure support CPAP.
It's good.
Set PEEP, change pressure support to how much volume you want to achieve. The patient takes all the breaths.
They're doing all the work. Yep. So this is our CPAP, and we can do this both invasively and non-invasively, right? When would you do this invasively?
Invasively. You mean?
Like when you're post-intubation, doing an SVT.
Mm-hmm.
When they're just falling
Try,
asleep, vent
or
patient.
trach patient who's awake, right? They might need some CPAP support, right? So what's the downside with non-invasive CPAP? What's the caveat?
Leaks, noise.
Well, so you got some leak problems if you can't get a good mask seal. What else? What else does the patient have to have when you're on CPAP?
They can't puke in the hole.
Yeah, they'll fill up that mask in a hurry, won't they?
What was your question again?
So what are the caveats of CPAP for an awake patient, non-invasive CPAP? You gotta have a patient that is what?
Able to spontaneously breathe.
Awake and breathing. They gotta be able to protect their airway, right?
Right.
So if they can't protect their airway, if they're somnolent, if they're having vomiting spells, something like that, CPAP's out. But it works really, really well to keep patients off the ventilator or to help them maintain post-intubation, right? If we're extubating them, trying to Good. So what's the next one on there?
Volume support.
Volume support. So what is volume support?
Pressure support and the volume and you're
Instead of
setting
pressure.
instead of
Yeah.
pressure.
So we talked about CPAP, but I don't know that we explained it super well. So with CPAP, right, we're just gonna give them a constant pressure in their face, right? So we're giving them extra 10 centimeters of water pressure, right? In volume support, we're gonna give them an extra,
volume in their face, right? So they're still breathing. We're going to give them, and instead of giving them extra pressure on their breath, we're giving them extra volume in their breath, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, right. Perfect.
SIMV volume, pressure support.
Okay, so what is SIMV?
Trying to think exactly what it stands for because it's been a while. It gives the patient to spontaneously breathe and gives the support, the pressure support set for the extra breaths and not full volume breath.
Yeah, absolutely. So it stands for synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation. It's one we use a lot, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, we have a lot of patients on SIMV. Why do you think that is?
That way you just give them the chance to, like, you can see their spontaneous breaths and see how well they do.
Yeah, a lot more comfortable
Give
with
them-
patients who are breathing on their own, right?
You can kind of turn them right down at your field.
To wean and
To
to.
wean it, so.
Yeah, I think it's a really advantageous mode of ventilation in a lot of settings, especially for those patients that are not totally unresponsive, totally unconscious. People who don't have paralyzed. Patients that are breathing on their own is a lot more comfortable, right? So basically, this is two modes of ventilation blended together, right? So in this case, the background mode of ventilation is volume control, right? So no matter what, they're getting a volume control mode of ventilation, right? No matter what they do. But on top of that, then they're getting pressure support or CPAP. So when they breathe, they get CPAP. When the vent breathes, they get volume control, which makes it really comfortable for them. They're not getting 560 if they trigger a breath. They're only getting what they get and a little help. So it's a really comfortable mode of ventilation. It's also a lot of peace of mind for our providers in the background because I know they're going to get the minimum that I set. So I'm going to set a minimum that they have to get every minute, and they're going to get that because the vent's going to make sure they get that, right? Versus pressure support or CPAP, maybe they get that, maybe they don't, right? So it helps them be able to breathe on their own, but also still gives me the confidence that, like, yeah, if they quit breathing, they give up, the vent just takes over and does its thing, right? So it's a really nice mode of ventilation. So there's a couple of versions of SIMV here. So you have one volume control, one pressure control, one PRVC, but those are just the underlying vent settings, right? Okay. All right, the last but certainly not least, what's bivent? I'm gonna take a stab at bivent.
Okay, adult practice.
So you have essentially a high and a low. You set the times that you're at each. You're always descending the lungs. It's like keeping it at a higher pressure control sort of, and then a PEEP below, and then there's dump breaths in between, and that's how you set your IDE ratio.
Yeah, and so in bivent, right, it's a total reversal of their IDE ratio almost, right? Where you just inspiratory hold, expiratory dump, inspiratory hold, expiratory dump, inspiratory hold. Really, really uncomfortable mode of ventilation, right? You guys paralyzing patients on bivent. Do you see bivent much in the unit?
We don't use
Not
it
as
a
much
lot,
as the kids. Yeah,
but we
well.
do like in the adult ICUs.
See,
And
adult
it's-
ICUs, I see it a good bit.
Yeah.
Using it a lot for ARDS. Trialed it with COVID, not as well, not as much success
Yeah.
as with ARDS, but.
We do every once in a while in take two, but it's like certain attendings that like to try it and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I've seen some good success with it. Are you paralyzing patients on bivent, or are you letting them
I've
breathe?
seen both. It depends on like
There's a
what
lot that
unit,
goes into
what
it.
attending.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot that goes into how much they want the patients working or
Yes.
not, right? Depending on how healthy their lungs are. I tend to be a fan if the patients are sick enough to need bivent to probably paralyze them because they probably need the lung rest anyway. But that's only my own 2 cents on it. I don't have any solid data to support that. But that's a really wholly different thing. So, what do you think we should put Stanley on? So I'm doing all the work here for Stanley. He's totally unresponsive. He's not doing anything on this.
I would go with volume control.
Okay, let's put him on. So let's choose volume control, and we have to pick some numbers here, right?
Okay.
So what tidal volume do you want?
So 480 to 560. So we're on 560 there. I'd probably do like 520, 510. Something like that. 480 to 560. I just put in 510. I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Anything scientific you did to come up with that, or just
I
you
mean,
got a range?
Yeah.
Yeah, just pick something in the middle. Yep, I agree. What about your rate?
Like you said, anywhere from 12 to 20. So 14, 16 usually is what I'd start at.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. What's next?
PEEP.
PEEP. PEEP of 5.
Yeah.
That's normal. Good. What about FiO2? What are you gonna pick for
So,
FiO2?
I usually determine that on if he's needing any more refreshment. Yeah, you're on room air. So
Yeah, so I'm ventilating him on room air, and his sats are 98%. So,
okay.
do you ever see patients on room air on a ventilator?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty rare though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Usually we have them at least on 25 or 30, right? They're
Not-
pretty.
I think it's. I was gonna say in peds we have room
Yeah,
air.
more on room air
Adults
probably.
it's almost always 25 or 30.
Yeah, it seems like we do a lot more at that 25 or 30, which I don't really understand because if you're ventilating on a room air, I don't see why we need to do anything. But we tend to give them at least a little bit. Of course, when in doubt, right, we just turn up the FiO2 and we can always titrate it down. Better to be overshoot it than undershoot it in the short term, right? Okay, what else do we need?
Eye time.
Okay.
Eye time? So what's normal for eye time?
1.
About a second in, right? Okay, what about, what's next?
T-pause.
T-pause, what's T-pause?
To be quite honest, I don't really turn that one much.
So that's your inspiratory pause, right? That slight, you go up, and then down, right? So that's that slight
Does
pause.
that even show up?
And then next you have rise time, which is how fast we're gonna run that air in, right? Okay. What about trigger flow?
Your sensitivity to them taking a breath.
So what do we usually set trigger flow?
Something to make it easy enough to overcome the tube, to where they.
Not on the tube, but if they do start breathing, like they're
Right.
It
not.
doesn't stack breaths.
Or everything.
Right. So trigger flow is a sensitive subject for me in some ways because I want the patient to be comfortable, right? But you have to balance that with, I don't want them to be triggering the vent. And I come from a transport environment where bounces and bumps and coughs and things trigger the vent a lot. And so you have to kind of balance the patient's needs with the the sensitivity of the vent, right? So we're talking about making the vent more or less sensitive, that's the trigger flow. So for Stanley, it doesn't really matter. So just for the ease of today, let's just turn it down, and we'll make that a negative number. But that's really the same as your PEEP, right? So you can't have it over PEEP or the vent will never stop, right? But you don't want it too far down because he's going to have to pull really hard to draw that breath, right? So that's where we set our trigger. I tend to be on I like the trigger a little lower, especially in the transport patients. But if everything's equal and they're breathing on their own and they're pretty calm and settled in bed in the unit somewhere, then having it pretty close to people make it a lot more comfortable. Okay. Everybody happy with those numbers? Okay, my hands get tired, so let's go ahead and hook him up here. Get carpal tunnel. Setting this. Alright. So have him on there. Is he happy?
He looks to be so far.
Okay, good. Alright, Paige, did we get all of that in our handout there?
So far for the ventilating settings, yes. So now that we have our baseline vent settings, let's look through the parameters and then discuss it.
Okay. So we're
Um,
gonna walk right through all those numbers on the vent there. So Shannon, we start there at the top.
Okay.
So we got 3 waveforms there. Yellow, green, and blue. Tell me about our waveforms.
Yellow is your pressure.
Okay, so everything's yellow. So the vent's nice to us. It makes everything color coded for us, right? So tell me about our pressure waveform there.
Pressure waveform is just initiation of breath, and we'll get a little bit of a bounce in between here. So, but initiation of breath and then end of breath back to our PEEP and then back up.
Yep. So what about the green waveform?
Green waveform is just your respiratory, and you can always tell if you fully exhale. It's a lot of times you can sort of tell how a patient's doing, like an asthmatic or whatever, if they're able to fully exhale with the rate that you have.
Yes, that's flow, right?
Yeah.
Air in versus air out.
Yeah.
Yep. And what about the blue waveform?
Blue waveform is just tidal volume.
Yep, it's volume. Yep. So you have pressure, flow, and volume.
Yep.
Perfect. So what about our numbers on the? So on this vent, across the bottom are what we've set. So those knobs underneath correspond to what we're doing, right?
Mhm.
So let's start with the numbers on the right hand side there. What do you see?
Peak pressure.
So what is peak pressure?
The highest pressure that it takes to achieve what ventilation you're trying to do with your patient.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we relate that to the anatomy of the patient, what piece of the anatomy reflects peak pressure?
The compliance of the lungs.
Maybe even a little less than that. I mean, it will affect peak pressure.
Yeah.
So is it big airways or small airways?
Oh, I gotcha. I would say what affects the peak airway? I would say big airways.
Yeah, so peak pressure relates to big airways, right? Okay, so we'll demonstrate that. So the biggest part of the airway is the ET tube, right?
Right.
Okay, so we immediately got that jump in peak pressure. So we're talking about peak pressure, relate that to the large airways. What's the next one on there?
The next is the mean.
Mean airway pressure. And mean and plateau are often used interchangeably, right?
Right.
So if peak pressure is the large airways, the mean airway pressure must be the small. So how do we derive a mean airway pressure?
Uh, it's just the most of the time it's half of what your peak is.
Ideally, right?
Ideally, yeah.
So that's actually the parabola. If you guys are calculus, it's the area under the curve. So if you think the pressure waveform is a curve, right, that area that's how we derive the mean airway pressure. But ultimately, it's the average airway pressure,
Yeah.
right? So I like to think of this as, did you ever see, I think it was the movie Volcano, and with Tommy Lee Jones. There's a subway scene where there's a bunch of water that flows down in the subway, and it hits the subway train, and knocks the train off the track. You guys remember that? There's a ride at Universal Studios, okay. So anyway, you think about this giant wave of water gushing down into a subway station, right? And it hits the train and it knocks the train off the track. Well, then it all settles down and levels out across the floor, right? Our airways do the exact same thing. The air rushes in and it bounces off all the large structures, right? And that's our peak airway pressure. And then as it settles in to all those smaller structures in the alveolar spaces, you get that level, right? So the peak airway pressure is that flow coming in, and the mean airway pressure is the leveling out, how much standing water has remained after we've all flooded the compartment, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's next?
PEEP.
Okay, so wait a minute, but we set PEEP.
Right.
Why are we measuring PEEP?
It's the actual measurement. Sometimes you can have auto PEEP.
Okay, so the patient may be generating their own PEEP.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense to me. What's next?
Respiratory rate, the actual measured.
Okay, we set that too, right?
Right, but you could breathe over top of that.
So, but in this case, Stanley's not, right? It's
Yeah.
about the same. So he's not breathing over top of that. Okay, that makes sense to me. What's the next one?
FO2.
Okay, I set that and I know Stanley didn't generate his own oxygen. So, pretty sure
Right.
I didn't miss that lecture in anatomy. So why are we measuring FiO2? It's got to be what I set, right?
To ensure the machine's giving what you set.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Just a safety check-in system, right? So we had an empty O2 cylinder, or even the gas coming from the wall was not right. Then we have a safety in our system to make sure that we are doing what we say we're doing. Perfect. What's next?
The IDE.
Okay, we set that, but that's what we're seeing there. It's measuring it for us. Okay, so what's the next one?
Minute volume.
So MVE, right? Minute volume expired. So what is that telling us?
The amount of air that we have given in a minute.
Well, what we've given it would be MVI,
well,
right?
what's the patient is received.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a minute.
So why do I care a lot more about MVE than MVI?
Because what the machine might be giving the patient, if you have a leak, the patient might not be seeing.
Okay, yeah, so MBE tells us about what participated, I know for sure participated in gas exchange, right? Because it was in Stanley's lungs and came back. So I like MBE a lot more. Yeah. Okay. So with an extra VTI and VTE, which are the individual tidal volume breaths, right? Okay, so are they the same?
They are not.
Okay, why shouldn't they be?
Why shouldn't they be the same? One, the compliance is not on for the vent for the circuit. So usually we do a tubing compliance to account for the air that's in the circuit.
Okay, but that shouldn't change, right?
Right.
So why is VTI and VTE, why are they not the same?
I guess during inspiration, some of the air could actually still make its way out the expiratory limb, so the patient doesn't see all the air that.
It could be. That could be. That would be a pretty small amount probably.
Okay. Partially patients that have a leak.
Yeah, so leaks could explain some of that. Let me ask you this. If I was able to create a ventilator system, let's say I had pipe tape and I took all of his connections and I pipe taped everything, sealed it perfectly, where there were absolutely zero leaks, and I welded the ET tube to his trachea. So that I put JB weld in there, and there was absolutely no way that any air escaped. It was all going to Stanley, it was all coming back to the vent, there were no leaks in the system, right? All these are just friction fittings, right? So, like, they all have a small leak to them. If I was able to completely seal the system, would Stanley still have a leak? Or would VTI and VTE be the same?
No.
No, why?
What do you think? I've always thought that maybe the vent needed calibrated. If it's not completely correct, like calibration might be off.
Nope, there's no problem with the vent.
Okay. What you got?
Can I make VTI and VTE the same? Would I want it to be the same?
No, because there's still gas exchange in the
gas exchange.
Okay.
yeah.
But
So you're
where
still
does that go?
losing some, not losing, but slightly getting trapped as it's exchanging throughout.
Okay, so let's talk about that, right? The physiology of that. So oxygen flows in, goes into the lungs, crosses the alveolar barrier, right? It crosses into its little hemoglobin life rafts, and it floats down the bloodstream where it's used by the cells. Krebs cycle, ATP production, and all of that, right? Aerobic metabolism. Out pops CO2, one molecule of oxygen in, one molecule of CO2 out, right? Does that know how that works?
Not
Well,
exactly
No, it's
every
not.
time, I don't think.
I mean,
I
do
mean,
oxygen and CO2 exchange in a 1-to-1 rate?
not exactly, I guess.
What about functional reserve capacity? Does that play a role? And so let's go back. Hold on. What do you mean not exactly? Any guess? Where does that extra CO2 go? So most of our room air, 78% roughly, is nitrogen, right? Some of that crosses the alveolar barrier, but it comes back and forth. It's roughly the same. The body doesn't use it, so that's really not the culprit, right? Nitrogen is just there, right? So it's really oxygen and carbon dioxide then that must be, there's something happening here. Do they exchange at a 1-to-1 rate? And if not, what rate do they exchange at and why?
I don't believe they exchange 1-to-1, but I don't know exactly the exchange rate.
Okay. Well, let's come back to that then.
Okay.
What about FRC? So the functional reserve capacity of the lungs. What about that? Does that account for some of that loss? I'm gonna draw my little diagram up here.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got slime, slime, slime. So this whole thing, total lung capacity, right?
Right.
So you have tidal volume, you guys have seen this before,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then we have the FRC, and then this is the expiratory reserve volume, inspiratory reserve volume, right? So this is the FRC, right? This is static volume though. Our tidal volume's on top of this. If we force an exhale, we can get it down to here. This is a static volume. Should never leave, right? This is why getting the wind knocked out of you hurts so badly, because you lose this RC down here, right? This vital reserve that you should never lose. So I'll buy that there might be a difference between VTI and VTE. Let's say we're just putting the patient on the vent, we have to fill this up. Then after that, our tidal volume just rides along on top of it, right? So this should be a static volume, shouldn't change. So the question then still remains, where'd that go?
Disappear too.
Yeah. So we're back to oxygen and carbon dioxide at a 1-to-1 rate, right? So if they don't exchange at a 1-to-1 rate, what happens to CO2? Must be CO2 not coming out, right? So where do we get that? What happened to it?
Where does it go?
Yeah.
I mean.
Anybody know? You guys help him out. It doesn't have to be all standing up. I'm looking at him, but. Sorry.
No, you're good, man. I mean, are you able to diffuse CO2 through other parts of your body? Like.
I guess in a way, kind of, but not really. Does the body have any other use for CO2? Is there any reason it holds on to it?
I know CO2 can, like, if it's high or low, can affect your blood flow.
How does it do that? That's an interesting concept.
Vasodilation, constriction.
Yeah. But what's the mechanism of that? And why would that be important? You're getting to something really profound here, I think.
Okay.
So what happens when it makes carbon dioxide and dissolve it into water? So if I have CO2, I add water, what do I get?
CO2 and water.
Ever seen that before? What is that? What is it?
It's bicarb.
Not quite. What is bicarb? Bicarb is HCO3.
Okay.
And
H.
does that look familiar to you? Have you ever seen this before?
Yeah.
What is this? Yeah, I told you we were going to go back to some of that chemistry, right? Some of that biology, right?
Dust offs.
So this is carbonic acid,
Okay.
which splits to bicarbon water.
Okay.
Or bicarbon, not water, bicarbon hydrates. This is the acid-base buffering equation. This is where your carbon dioxide goes. So what doesn't come back out in the lungs is retained by the body to be used as the acid side of the acid-base balance of the body, right? Okay. So the medulla deliberately holds some CO2 dissolved in water in the bloodstream to maintain its acidity.
I see. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, have you ever heard of the respiratory quotient? CO2 and oxygen exchange at a 0.8 rate.
Okay.
Because of this.
Okay.
Make sense? So that's where your extra CO2 goes. But you're right. For practical purposes, clinically, VTI and VTE represent a leak. Right? So big difference is a leak. But 0.8 difference is physiologic.
Okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So no, it can't ever be, shouldn't ever be the same. Interesting enough that you could change this. This is just kind of, I'm going to nerd out here for you for a minute because that's just the way I am.
No,
you can actually change your underlying respiratory quotient with a high enough protein diet. If you put yourself into ketosis, you can actually make oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in the water. Makes me not want to do keto, knowing that. I'm like, probably seems like it's important. I probably shouldn't try to change this about myself. There are a lot of things about me that I should probably change. Respiratory quotient probably admit. right? But interestingly enough, you put your patient on enough protein, you can actually get it at a 1-to-1 rate.
Huh.
Because the body no longer needs to retain CO2, it's got all those ketones. So it'll start putting that CO2 back out because of a 1-to-1 ratio because it doesn't need it anymore. So that's not enough. So, but that's where the rest of this goes, and that's at a 0.8 rate. So you'll have seen this, I'm sure, before in some of your equations, and we'll talk about the respiratory quotient. We're going to come back to that later. But, so that's where that goes. So at least 0.8 of that loss goes to that physiology. A little deeper than we thought about in a while, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, that's good though.
I'm
Right?
going down
Oh,
at work last night and I slept.
Yeah, you are.
Throwing all the math at you in chemistry today, aren't we? Okay. So, Paige, where are we? Sorry, we just kind of went off on a thing there, didn't we?
The next one where I was explaining the difference between compliance, elastance, and
Oh,
resistance.
next page. Yes, that's where we were. Shannon, next page for us. Thank you. On the vent there. Next page of values.
The difference between compliance and what now?
Elastance and
Go ahead. Go
resistance.
ahead. Next page on the values on the vent.
okay.
See the additional values there?
Yep.
And I don't think we missed anything in this thing.
Okay.
MVI is the same as you know, our calculating basically it's just rate and tidal volume, right? So we know what the MVI is. We don't have to have the vent tell us that necessarily. So go to the next page. Now, will you do an expiratory hold for me? Thank you, sir. And do the other one.
Do inspiratory?
Yep, inspiratory hold as well. And we'll generate some values here. Did we get 'em? There we go. So, all right, let's talk about it here. What's the first one?
PEEP tot.
Peep tot. It's like a tater tot, not nearly as delicious, right? What is a peep tot?
Total heat.
Total peep. So this is static, right? Measuring our expiratory hold, and this is his peep. Okay. What else?
Static compliance.
So we have C stat, static compliance, and that is big C, and then we have big E. What is big E? So little e is expiratory, right?
Yeah.
Little I, little e are expiratory. M is minute, V is ventilation, R is rate. But big E is, C is compliance, big E must be elastance. Perfect.
Okay.
Yep. And then we have dynamic compliance right below that, C dyne. Okay. So static compliance is measured in a static state, dynamic compliance is measured in a flow state. Tell me a little bit about compliance and elastance.
In the way of ventilation, how it can affect it.
What is compliance? What are we measuring? What are we looking at?
Stretchable your lungs.
How stretchy they are. Perfect. That's well said. Absolutely. And what about elastance?
I guess how far they can.
Like it snaps.
Yeah.
How
Yeah,
reboundy.
Yeah.
How reboundy. Yeah, absolutely. How snappy, right? So we have stretchy and reboundy, right? So we have compliance and elastance. Okay, perfect. So what would be good numbers? And Stanley doesn't do this super well. Just fair warning. His numbers are not that great, I don't think.
I don't really ever look at the numbers in the PEDS world. Like before that, it's been a while. What do you got over here in adult world? You guys ever use it?
We don't use this as much as we should use
No,
it.
we
Yeah.
don't look, I look at trends necessarily, but I don't look at like.
Yeah. So closer to 100 is better, right? You want them
Okay.
higher, right? More compliant, more elastic, right?
Okay.
Okay, so give me something not medical that has good compliance and good elastance in everyday item.
Fibrosis has.
Not medical, everyday
Oh,
item. Give me
sorry.
something everyday item that's good compliance and good
Rubber
elastance.
bands?
Yeah, rubber band, right? Not the big, thick, stretchy gum bands, but like a regular rubber band, right? Stretches and come backs really easy, right? Okay, what about something with good compliance but poor elastance?
Uh,
Stretch out, but not snap back.
Plastic bag. Blow out.
Yeah, it doesn't really stretch out so much.
Okay.
I like bubble gum,
Okay.
right? Blows out, but then like just
Doesn't want to come back. I guess.
doesn't really do anything, right? So it stretches really easily, but doesn't really come back very well. What about something with poor compliance, poor elastance? Or, I'm sorry, poor compliance but good elastance.
A balloon.
So So a balloon, well, I guess it would depend on what you mean, right?
Yeah.
So generally a balloon would be fairly stretchy both ways, right? What about something that's really hard to stretch, immediately comes back?
I guess like the workout band.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, workout band's perfect. I like to think in my mind, I picture the big water balloon launchers,
Yeah.
right? That you gotta like all the way back and let go.
Yeah.
Like really hard to stretch, but right back to its original shape, right? So what about poor compliance and poor elastance?
Uh,
A can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, something airfield like a can or a basketball. I like a basketball, right? I can blow it up till it pops. It's not gonna get any bigger. And take all the air out of it, it really doesn't get any smaller. It won't bounce, but it won't get any smaller, right? It's gonna stay the same size. So no stretch, no comeback at all, right? So I think we probably don't use these numbers as much as we should. I think these are great numbers to help fine tune your event, right? When you're watching compliance numbers and we do an expert hold on your patient. So let's say we're trying to get somebody to oxygenate who's kind of stubborn, just doesn't want to oxygenate very well. So I'm playing with my PEEP and my FiO2 and I'm playing with my tidal volume and my rate, trying to figure out the right combination of settings. If you watch your compliance numbers, they'll get better, better, and better, better, and then oh, not so good, not so good, not so good, right? So as they get better, you'll find a peak, and that is the sweet spot. That's where the patient's going to ventilate the best that you can do, right? When you hit that peak compliance number, as you start making changes, check your compliance, and as the compliance gets better, eventually it'll start to drop off again as you go over that other side of where the best tidal volume was, we'll say is, right? So if we watch those compliance numbers, that's one good way to tweak the vent to get the best oxygenation we can get or the best ventilation we can get out of a particular patient or setting at a time, right? And I think this also is nice, Paige brought up trending those over days, right? Is the patient getting better or worse, right? So if our vent settings haven't really changed much, are they getting better or worse? And I think that's a great way to kind of, you know, chart that day in and day out. But I love using it to tweak my vent numbers too. So if I'm making changes on the vent, watch those compliance numbers, see if they're getting better, see if they're not getting better. And that lets me kind of dial in right exactly where I want to be. All right, what's next? Nope, no, go
Oh,
back
I'm
to
sorry.
that's okay.
I thought you.
Any more values on that page we haven't talked about? Resistance?
RIRE?
Yeah, so resistance, inspiratory, expiratory. Now, Stanley doesn't do resistance well. But what would cause increased resistance?
In an intubated patient
Or an ED patient?
Like the size of the tube even.
So the tube can be a big one, especially in kids. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We chronically undersize tubes in kids, right?
Right.
Oh, I got a 3-year-old tube with a 2.5. You're like,
Yeah.
thanks. We'll change that out. It's fine. Sitting in his airway doing them, just bouncing around in between his vocal cords. Yeah. So that's a big one. We can chronically undersize tubes. Would that give you inspiratory or expiratory resistance? Probably.
Probably both.
Probably
Honestly,
both.
yeah.
Unless you had a big leak on the expiratory side.
Yeah.
Probably both, right? What would give you expiratory resistance alone?
Asthma.
Yeah, asthma is much more expiratory resistance than inspiratory resistance. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. So what other numbers do we have on there? Work breathing. What's Stanley doing? Bum is doing nothing, is
riding
he?
the vent.
Yeah, he's riding a vent. He's doing nothing. Our work breathing number is what, like 1 or something, right? And that's like joules per liter, I think, or something like that. And so it's talking about his work. And Stanley's a bum. He's not doing any work. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the main page. Page, where are we on our? Talked about our vent settings.
So next thing is we should also get a baseline ABG. Let's look at
Oh, let's do that. Yeah. So through the magic of technology and science, Shannon, will you go back just to main page on the vent there for me?
Yeah.
All right. Through the magic of science, here's Stanley's ABG in real time.
Oh no.
Right. So, what do you notice about what we've given you here? What's so?
A little more on that.
PaO2, PaCO2, and pH. What are these numbers? One's P little a, one's P big A. What's the difference there?
One's alveolar.
Alveolar, yeah. So big A is alveolar, right? So we have arterial and alveolar gas. Absolutely. So we can calculate that. Have you guys seen the alveolar gas equation before? I have. I imagine that that's coming back to some time in school that you don't want to remember. I'm not going to make you calculate anything today, but we can calculate predicted alveolar gas. But for the sake of ease of today, and that's in your handout. For the ease of today, we're going to just give you the alveolar gas. You don't necessarily need to know that you can calculate it. I'm sure that you can work a calculator. But we do want to understand the relationship between arterial and alveolar gases and why that's so important. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later. How do you feel about those? Are those close enough? Yeah. But you can, so this is something you can do in your patients too. Use the alveolar gas equation to calculate what the alveolar gas concentration would be versus what you know the arterial gas concentration to be. And that tells you what?
How well you're exchanging.
Yeah. And so what do we call that? You may have seen it written this way.
Gradient.
Yep. Or this way.
PF ratio.
Right? Or this way. Right? Or this way. Right? All the same thing. You know what's really frustrating to me? Is that we never explain this to anybody. We never explain this to anybody. The nurses are calculating PF ratio. That's what they're doing. That's the criteria they're using now. It's a poor man's alveolar gas equation. They're calculating this to determine severity of ARDS. But if you ask them what the AA gradient is, they have no idea. They don't know what you're talking about. And the physicians don't know either, so you know what is VQ mismatch. Or shunt. We're all saying the same thing differently, which drives me insane. Because we're talking about the same thing. We all understand it. We all understand it in different terms, right? It seems like the respiratory therapists yourselves know that as AA gradient, right? But PF ratio is the same thing as a poor man's alveolar gas equation. VQ mismatch is describing the same phenomenon as so is shunt, right? So know that this is all talking about the same thing. But we keep using these different terms. We use PF ratio because it's a lot easier. There's not as much math involved. So it's PaO2 and FiO2 instead of the alveolar gas equation. But then that goes back to the Berlin criteria for ARDS. House circular ARDS patients was based on PF ratio, which is really the same calculation all the time, right? It's FiO2 and PO2. Well, this is PaO2 and alveolar O2. So, okay.
Those two. Discuss pH and the respiratory system role and balance.
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit, right? So we have Stanley's pH here. He's actually a touch alkalotic, so he's going to start out the next little bit of this with a touch alkalotic, but right on the edge, right? He's still normal. So we talked about the alveolar gas equation. So CO2 exists in the body as an acid, so CO2 builds, its pH is going to do what?
CO2 builds, it's going to get more acidotic.
Yeah, which means it'll go which way?
Down.
Down. Right, perfect. Can you predict where his pH will be given a CO2?
Sort of, but then the metabolic side can affect your pH as well. So.
Kind of, yeah. So you can predict it. The metabolic side is really slow.
Yeah.
So in the short term, you can actually predict that pH and CO2. We're going to talk about that a little bit more.
Okay.
Discuss the lung volumes observed on the physiology.
Oh, yeah. So here are his lung volumes. And what we're seeing here is this amount. So this static amount at the end of the graph. Okay.
Observe the cardiac output reading.
So we got that. We're not going to spend time on that. We just did that one.
Yep.
So we got cardiac output there. Looking good.
To list the changes that occur with hypoventilation. To be able to explain the buffering of CO2. Be able to explain and describe the available oxygen reserves. Be able to explain the relationship between end-tidal CO2, alveolar CO2, and arterial CO2. And be able to utilize the alveolar gas equation. What we don't know is that Stanley's accident wasn't an accident at all. As it turns out, his girlfriend is trying to off him. When she finds out that he survived his accident, she comes to visit him, determined to finish the job. Realizing that she can't turn off any equipment without someone becoming suspicious, she turns down his ventilator. Set the ventilator to Taiwan with 280 and a rate of 7.
Okay. So we're gonna change or turn our ventilator way down.
You actually want me to turn this, or?
Yep.
280 and a rate of 7.
Okay.
So
Hopefully someone has their alarm set pretty good.
Yeah, that'd be good. Maybe she's a respiratory therapist.
oh, she's smart.
Oh, she
She's
changed
already
the
figured
alarm.
that part out.
I don't like her.
I don't like her.
She figured out she better turn down the alarm profile on there, so poor Stanley doesn't even know what's hitting him.
We have the advantage of seeing Sam's blood gases change in real time, so let's watch and observe.
So much like the hemorrhage exercise that we did before, we're going to just kind of watch Stanley and see if we can predict what's going to happen with his physiology. Okay. So what do you think will happen? Do you think his oxygen will fall faster? Will he become hypoxic or hypercarbic first?
Hypercarbic.
And why?
Cause he's not breathing enough.
Right. So that's predicted, right? Is he's going to become hypoxic and hypercarbic eventually, right?
Right.
We're going to let this run for 10 minutes, and we'll see how bad Stanley gets over 10 minutes. Do you think he'll survive that 10 minutes, or do you think he'll arrest in 10 minutes of that, those settings? Yeah. So he's definitely going to get sick, though, right? I think we all can agree that Stanley's not going to do so well with this. So you think he's going to get hypercarbic first? Everybody agree? Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about AA gradients. This is something that we probably don't spend enough time on, or at least most of us don't spend enough time on in school. In discussing shunts and why diffusion across the lungs, obviously it's important, right? Because you got to have oxygen. But I don't think we really conceptualize just how poorly or how sensitive we are to shunt, or that lack of gradient. So I'm gonna kind of demonstrate that here. I've got a small graph, and I'm not gonna be too complicated with it here. But so if we have and then we'll say this is to here, so 0 to 100%. Okay, so with no shunt, we end up with a line that looks about like this, where if this is his PaO2 of 400, and we'll say 0 here. So that's 0 shunt. So as we increase his FiO2, we don't even get to 100%, and his PO2 is 400. Right? That would be a normal shunt. Where do you think you're no longer going to be able to oxygen? What percentage? So this is 0%. Oh, it's been 2 minutes. Take a look at our numbers here. PO2 is 104, CO2 is 44, 7.41. What do you think? About the same, better, or worse?
I mean, a little worse, but
Okay. Certainly no better.
yeah.
Still agree? CO2's rising? Okay. Keep an eye on it. Good luck, Stanley. Okay, so 0% shunt, his PO2 will rise precipitously as we increase his FiO2, right? What percent shunt do you think that we'll no longer be able to increase his oxygenation no matter what we do?
1%. So that's 0% at the top.
So, and actually this line, we'll say the baseline here, here's 100, here's 0. So even at FiO2 of 21%, right, this is room air, he'll still be 80, 90 PO2, right, pretty easily, 0% shunt. What percent shunt do you think he no longer increases his oxygen? Any guesses? So where this line would be flat. No matter what you do, he's going to have a PO2 of 50. Oh, there's some other unacceptably low number. It's a lot less shunt than you think.
Really?
It's only 50%.
Yeah, I was going to say 60. Yeah.
And actually, you start to get, that's 30. That's 20. And we start getting up to like 15 here, right? 10, 5, so on. But at 50% shunt, no matter what you do with this FO2, you won't be able to increase the oxygenation. That's how sensitive we are to this AA gradient. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a really kind of a, that's my hand, it's awful, wow, can't do that at all. Sorry for that. So, it doesn't take a very big shunt, very big mismatch here to cause us problems. And so that's kind of what we wanted to illustrate with the AA gradient, and we're talking about alveolar arterial CO2. It doesn't take a whole lot here to really make us in trouble. Alright, so Stanley's roughly on room air, right? We'll talk a little bit about oxygen stores. Where does the body store oxygen? Where do you hold on to oxygen?
Red blood cells, I guess.
Okay, yeah, so blood, bound hemoglobin, right? Where else? Where's the obvious place?
The lungs.
Lungs, yeah. Mm-hmm. Anywhere, any other guesses? Couple other ones. So we have dissolved in tissues, a little bit, and we have a little bit in myoglobin. Okay. So on room air, take a stab. How many milliliters of oxygen do you think you have in your lungs on room air? 21%.
How many milliliters?
Milliliters. Yep. We'll do it in milliliters of oxygen.
Okay. At 21%.
Mhm. So
Uh,
figure this volume. How many milliliters of that is oxygen?
are you looking for a percent?
No, milliliters. How many?
Milliliters,
Right.
okay.
Any ideas? Guesses?
80.
So we have 450.
Okay.
What do you think about dissolved bound hemoglobin? This is normal on 21 room air.
Mm, no clue. Yeah.
So it's actually a little bit more. So we're at 850
Okay.
bound hemoglobin. I'll give you these. These are 50 and 200.
Okay.
Right? 4 grand total. 1,550 milliliters of oxygen. Right? But there's a caveat. This is PaO2 40 and of 20 respectively. So you don't get to access this until your PaO2 falls precipitously.
Okay.
So they're not really that helpful. So really your oxygen is coming from here. This is really your storage. There's a little bit here that you'll eventually give up, but if you're waiting to PaO2 of 20, it's not really helping you much.
Right.
Right? Okay. Alright, let's go back to Stanley here. Uh-oh. What's going on?
So it seems like our oxygen's dropping faster than our CO2 is building.
So oxygen's definitely falling.
Yeah.
What's going on with his heart?
Starting to
PVCs?
Yeah, that you were speaking of.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit earlier, didn't we?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So his heart's getting hypoxic again.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. His saturations are falling. CO2's up. He's at 51 now. What do you think? Still think his O2's falling, or his CO2's rising faster than his O2's falling?
No. I would say the O2's falling faster than it's rising.
Why do you think that is? I would agree with you.
Because of the respiratory quotient, is it the
Close.
difference in oxygen and
Close, yeah. Tell me about that.
just because he's consuming oxygen quicker and putting out more CO2,
What's the body doing with the CO2?
holding on to it.
Okay, yeah, so the body can buffer it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is an important concept with this, is that you've got here, our oxygen is falling faster because you have a very limited store of oxygen.
Gotcha.
That's all you got, right? But the body, at least in the short term, can hide carbon dioxide. you notice his pH is falling, but it's still normal. The body's buffering the carbon dioxide
To try
um,
to make the
and
pH
hiding it.
last.
Now, eventually, it's going to run out of hiding places, right? But for now, we can at least buffer this. So here's Stanley's gases.
Yeah, big difference from the last.
Yeah, it went from like 160, right, to 50, and it only went from 45 to 53. So the body's buffering that carbon dioxide, and that's the big takeaway. Your O2 is going to fall faster than your CO2 rises
Okay.
because of that limited store. So what do you want to do about it?
I mean, being that we know.
So you're the you all are the yeah. So you're all the skilled RTs that you are, and you walk into a patient and you look at their vitals and you go, oh crap.
You bump the O2 up.
That's exactly what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually okay with it, right? Obviously, we know we did this to Stanley, so we know this is not what's going to fix him, right? Because we did this. But if you walked in and you saw your patient's O2 sats were 80%, I hope you'd run over and hit the O2 breath button while you were investigating something, right? Because who knows what's causing this? But regardless, he needs 100% oxygen. So let's do that. Instead of hitting the O2 breath button, Shannon, just turn that up to 100% so it'll last a long. Because otherwise, it'll come.
Okay.
Warned us at 60, didn't it? Wait, you sure?
It did.
Yeah. Wait, you sure? You sure you want to go that high? Seems, maybe we shouldn't go that high. Okay, so we turn Stanley up to 100%. We fix him? What do you say?
I'm gonna say.
I mean, he's a lot less likely to die right now. I'll give you that.
Right. But still, at some point, you're gonna stop buffering, and the CO2 is gonna catch up.
Yeah. We still have a metabolic problem here, don't we? So immediately, when our got our PO2 back up, that's good. But look at our pH.
Still, yeah.
It's not only not up, it's down. It's still falling because we didn't fix the underlying cause. We did this to a lot of people downtown, back in the day in the emergency department. Penny pitcher night in Vent, and we bring these drunk kids in, right? And you put them in a hallway bed because the ED was full, and put a pulse ox on their finger. I said, oh, their sats are a little low. Put them on Canada, a couple of liters. The drunk would sleep it off. It's fine. Pulse ox got better. We felt better about it. We didn't fix anything though, because the problem was really a ventilation problem. So let's look at Stanley. So ultimately we have to fix the ventilator, right? We all agree with that.
Right.
So what is Stanley's oxygen stores now? So now he's 100%. How much do you think is in his lungs? Guesses? Put him on 100%. His lungs are plumb full.
He's. I'm guessing. But
It was like 800.
that's what I was
A liter.
popped in my head. 3,000. Okay.
We filled up that whole lung space, right?
Okay.
So we went from 20% to 100%. So we filled up that whole lung space. Now we got 3,000. What about his hemoglobin?
Go with, I guess. I don't know. 9,000. Is that what you're gonna put? 9,500.
Now you only have so many molecules of hemoglobin, right?
That's what I was
So
gonna say,
once you
yeah.
bind them all, you
That's
bound
what-
them all, right? So we'll increase it a little bit, but we can't, once you bound hemoglobin, you bound it.
Right.
And we can increase this a little bit. This really not even so much, but that gives us 4,042.50 of total oxygen reserve. So why did I bother writing that up there? What am I trying to say?
He's still
Basically, he has more of a reserve to pull from in order to try to correct the situation, but we haven't corrected.
Yeah, so we still have to, so there's two sides to this coin, right? We have to address the oxygenation and the ventilation side.
Right.
So oxygen and CO2 both. 1, 2, this is why it's so important we pre-oxygenate these patients before we do a trial, before we intubate them, before we do anything. It's so important to fill up that reserve with oxygen because this is where your reserve comes from. Remember, you don't even get access to this really. And so really your reserve is all here in the lungs. And that's why pre-oxygenation prior to RSI, prior even to, you know, an extubation challenge, give them a little extra oxygen before you let them off will really help buffer them. You will die from hypoxia before you'll die from hypercarbia because your body can buffer it away for a little while. Eventually, it's going to be a problem, but you can buffer it for a while, right? So the key here is that's kind of the point I'm trying to make is that pre-oxygenation in sweat is so important because all of your oxygen reserve is in the lungs and your body can handle some CO2 for a little while, right? Nobody really dies from hypercarbia during RSI that die from hypoxia when we can't get them intubated, right? So fill up all those alveolar spaces. Get the lungs pumped full of oxygen. Remember, the brain softens before the lung hardens. As our old medical director used to say. So. All right, let's reset Stanley. Let's put him back to normal. And I'm uncomfortable with his vent settings. So.
Okay.
Okay. Getting back up to. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So, Paige, let's go all the way back here to the obstructive shock exercise. Did we miss anything in that? I think we got it. Yeah, I want to make sure I didn't miss
The only thing we
anything.
didn't talk about was alveolar dead space.
Ah, okay. So let's talk a little bit. I do want to touch on that for a minute. So what is alveolar dead space? Why is it important? Let me ask you this. On our baseline ABG here, our PaCO2 is not the same as our end-tidal CO2. Should it be? Can it be?
But it's not typically
Why?
because of dead space.
Because of alveolar dead space. Tell me about that.
It's essentially like, how to explain it? Well, it's like, I don't want to say like the leftover, but what's not being. What's the word I'm looking for?
I mean, on events, if we have too much tubing between the patient and the circuit,
It's just like
that
sitting
space is
there.
just
Yeah.
being rebreathed, so you hold on to more
Like
CO2.
what's not being like circulated, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Perfused. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
That's a good word.
Are all alveoli perfused the same?
No.
Okay. Why not?
Multiple reasons like physiologic, even just like the way the disease processes, size, the way the patients.
Okay. Good. So yeah, so that's true. So we have what's called alveolar dead space. So in this example, we've got blood flow coming to the lungs here. Excuse my really terrible drawing, but you get the idea. And here at the top, we're sampling our end-tidal CO2. So we have air coming in and out. We have blood coming in and out of the lungs through the vasculature. Okay. So if I've got 40 millimeters of mercury, 40 millimeters of mercury coming in, my end-tidal CO2 should be 40 millimeters of mercury, right? Makes sense. Except not all alveoli are perfused the same. So you do have some dead space in alveoli, but also you have all of this dead space as well. Right? So you have all of that other gas that's going to mix and dilute it somewhat. What if I said that I've got a blockage here? So now, let's back that up. I've got a blockage here. So now this is 0, no CO2. This is still 40, right? And up here I've got 0 coming from here, 40 coming from here. So now my end tidal is 20. What am I describing? My central CO2 is still 40, but now I have an alveolar dead space because I've got lack of perfusion to that alveoli. But it's not just one, it's a bunch.
I mean, there's not really gas exchange with the alveoli, so it doesn't accept anything, so it's not putting out anything
Right.
either, so it doesn't really
So what big clinical example would give me an end tidal of 20 but a central CO2 of 40?
shunt, please.
What kind of shunt? Big shunt? PE is a big one. Yeah. So remember, in our AAA gradient, I like to describe this as the cloudy shower door, right? You have a shower door, I've got air on one side, I have water on the other, right? I need to get light in and out. That's my oxygen. That's my light in and out. So there's a couple ways I can screw this up. I got soap scum on my shower door. Light can't get in. Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
If my water goes out, my hot water goes out, I'm not getting perfusion. I'll be cold and miserable in the shower. Right? So you've got it, and then if I don't have light on in the bathroom, light's not coming in. So I gotta have ventilation, I gotta have a clear shower door, I gotta have blood flow. And that's how I can mess this up. Right? Alveolar dead space explains for a small difference between end tidal CO2 and central CO2. Can end tidal ever be higher than central CO2? Nope.
I wouldn't
Nope.
think. No.
Even if you rebreathe CO2, say on your anesthesia machine and your CO2 absorber is full, and you start rebreathing CO2, your central CO2 actually rise to meet that. It's because it can diffuse way easier than oxygen does. So they should always be the same. End tidal should always be a little bit less. Right? But it's a consistent less, because it's based on alveolar dead space. So as long as you have this drastic difference tells you something pathologic. But a 3-point difference is consistent because it's alveolar dead space, and you're not going to all of a sudden perfuse an alveoli and then not perfuse it again later, right? That may change in patient over time, but it's not going to change hour to hour, day to day, right? So you can bank on, this is going to go back to this predictive PCO2 and predictive pH. So if I know my end tidal, if I know end tidal is 40, I can predict, and my pH, what was it? pH is 7.45 and my end tidal is 40. Take my end tidal 20, what will my CO2 be? Or my pH be? I mean, you know, sorry.
End tidal,
If I take my end tidal from 40 to 20,
mm-hmm.
what's going to happen to my
pH is going to
pH?
go up.
By how much?
I would say you would probably at least be 7.5 to 7.6.
So it's going to go up by 0.16.
0.16, okay.
Every 10 move in CO2 changes pH by 0.08 in the opposite direction. They're inversely proportional, right? Now, Shannon mentioned earlier that your metabolic system can compensate for that, and it can in the long term, but it's not going to react in minutes, right? So why is this important to us? How many times can you draw blood gas in an hour? I mean, logistically speaking, it just, you can only do it so many times, right?
Right.
Not to mention, like, a poor patient, if you're sticking them 15 times in an hour, you're making vent changes, right?
Right.
So we don't need that. If I have a starting point and I'm trying to correct a respiratory acidosis, or I'm trying to compensate for a metabolic acidosis, I can do that with my end tidal. I have a starting point, check my gas, make a bunch of changes, make a bunch of corrections, fix the patient, check it again at the end. And I should be right on. I should be able to predict exactly what my pH is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So a great example of that might be like a DKA patient, right, where they're compensating with their respiratory system for metabolic acidosis. You can predict how well they'll compensate. Does that make sense? There's actually a formula for how much they can compensate. But keep that in mind, that those things are inextricably linked. CO2, pH are permanently inextricably linked. So 10-point change in CO2, we'll say, well actually just EtCO2, 10 points equals 0.08 pH in the opposite direction. It's inversely proportional, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So if I was 7.45 and I go up by 0.16, 7.61. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So keep that in mind as you're working with these patients. We're not using end tidal to its full potential, I found, in the hospital. Something EMS has been doing a long time. But for whatever reason, the hospital's been really slow to pick up on this. I love Ventilator because it's giving me real-time information, and if you know how to use it, it's already there. It's already hooked up, right? If I'm making a bunch of vent changes, I want an end title number because I know exactly what I'm doing. Not only so I have oxygenation and ventilation, but now I also have be able to relatively guess my blood gas.
Like a reference point as to.
As long as you have a reference point to start from, right? I can't predict what their pH will be. There are too many metabolic factors to get that from baseline. But once I have a baseline, I know what I can do to change it. Right? Make sense? So that's what we wanted to get to with this entitled CO2 thing. Okay. We get all of that stuff?
Yep.
And I'll be with space and all of that. Now let's go back to the obstructive shock exercise. We've gotten all the rest of that. Just fast forward there. You're going to skip a couple there.
Yeah, hold on. Talking about obstructive airway exercise.
Obstructive shock.
Oh, there it is.
Yep.
Okay. To be able to recognize rapidly changing monitored values, to recognize the presence of obstructive shock, to be able to diagnose an acute crisis situation, and to be able to clinically treat the patient. Ask the moderator to create a catastrophe.
One catastrophe coming up.
I call man open catastrophe. Comes in and drones off work floor.
That's hilarious. I love it.
Okay, so we've got a catastrophe happening. Tell me what you see.
Oh, peak pressures.
What's going on? Something's changing with Stanley pretty rapidly.
So, as she said, peak pressure change, which means compliance has changed.
CVP increase.
Wait a minute.
Feels-
So I've got a mismatch now. Got a gradient now. What happened? Notice that CO2 didn't get that gradient. CO2 diffuses so much easier across the alveolar membrane that you very rarely have a CO2 gradient unless you have something big like a PE, right? So we've got, our pH has really not been affected yet, but we've definitely got an oxygen gradient. What's going on with his vital signs?
Heart rate's up a little bit,
Sats are down.
I mean, first thing I would think is maybe try to suction the ET tube to
Yeah,
see if there's
okay.
blockage.
You got elevated peak pressure. I like your thought process here. Got a little hypoxia, got elevated peak pressure. Yep. Except one thing doesn't fit. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is not the same. What doesn't fit?
CVP, so.
It went up.
What's that?
It went up. Explain that.
It's.
Yeah, neither can I.
I mean,
let's make
yeah.
this worse. This will get worse. Let's make it worse.
Okay, neither can
We wait long enough, it'll always get worse, right? So we'll just make it worse. Maybe it'll help us come up with a diagnosis. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Okay, so now we are peak pressuring and not delivering the volumes anymore.
CVP's so
So-
blood pressure.
Okay. So remember in the okay, so we've got, here's our gas again. Our gradient's getting worse and worse. We're starting to even maybe get a slight CO2 gradient. So whatever's going on is bad. Our pH has fallen a little bit. Tell me about the vital signs. Heart rate of 130, SAS of 70, 77 over 57, that's bad. Right? Shock state, everybody agree? Right? Tachycardia, hypotension, shock state, right? Except one of these things is different.
I mean, usually your heart rate goes up when your CVP goes down.
One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is not the same. What is going on with that?
Right. I mean,
What causes CVP to go up in a shock state? That doesn't make sense. We just bled Stanley to death earlier, and CVP was like the first thing to fall, right?
either like a clot of some sort or like
So Shannon, tell me about what your vent's telling you.
The compliance has changed for some reason. Either I'm guessing.
What's his mean airway pressure?
Mean airway is still only 9.
That's good, right?
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with his small airways. Because if this were ours or something, you'd expect his mean to be, his peak pressure to be 39, his mean airway pressure to be 30, right?
Right.
You'd expect that to be pretty terrible. So we've got an isolated elevated peak pressure,
Okay.
tachycardia, hypotension,
And CVP.
hypoxia, but with signs of volume overload. What do you think's going on? Guesses?
Like,
Paige, what do you think?
like he said, some sort of clot or something is going on. Or like a pneumo, like a
Ooh,
That's what I was
what's it called?
going to
wanna
say.
go with pneumo?
A closed pneumo.
Could be. How would you investigate that?
A chest X-ray.
We could do a chest X-ray. You shouldn't, but we could. And we will. So here's his chest X-ray. What do you see? Now this is a chest X-ray that should never be taken. This is a clinical diagnosis, and hopefully you won't ever do get this X-ray back. What do you see?
We're
You can look at it.
hyperexpanded.
Yeah, come up,
Yeah,
look at it.
definitely
Hyperexpanded.
Kind of.
On the.
Worse than that.
I mean, the left is.
Okay, so let's
The
start
lung
simple, right?
marking.
Okay.
Yeah.
The lung, there's no
So,
lung marking.
ABCs, right?
Right.
So airway. Here's the trachea.
You know, it looks like it's
Right.
shredded.
Left, right main stem bronchus. It's a little off to one side. That's not good. Okay.
Okay.
So that's airway breathing.
Okay.
So we see here lungs tissues, all the way out to the side here. Here we see lung, but it's right
So.
here. What's all this? Air.
Yeah.
Okay, circulation. There's the heart. Well, wait a minute. The heart should be on the left side of the chest. It's not. It's half on the right side, half in the middle. It should be almost all on the left side, right?
Did we have a collapse?
So what do we got?
Shift?
What do you call that? It's not a pneumo. It's a what pneumo? It's like a pneumo, but worse.
I know,
No. It's a pneumothorax, but it's a special kind of pneumothorax. What's worse than a pneumo?
I mean.
You mean like a closed pneumo, like where it's in the.
There's a special word we have for this. It's causing a shock state. It's not just a pneumo. It's pneumo causing obstructive shock because it's literally compressing the great vessels, compressing the heart. It's got so much pressure in the thorax it's causing the IVC to go stuck because blood can't get back to the heart. That's why your CVP is so high. What would you call that? You know the word for it? You're right, it's a pneumo, but it's a special kind of pneumo. It's the life-threatening kind. It's a tension pneumo. It's a tension pneumo, right? Because you created this high pressure state.
Yeah.
And that mediastinal shift across, which actually to his right, mediastinal shift across where you're compressing the vessels in the heart, this is immediately life-threatening, right? So we do a lot of things with pneumos. Maybe we'll just watch them, they're small, might not do anything with them, right? We might put a little pigtail in, we might put a chest tube in. But this is a true emergency, something you gotta deal with right now. Because you're literally causing them to be in a severe shock state due to vital signs. So what are we gonna do about it? How do you fix a tension pneumo?
Decompress.
D, needle D. Needle D, who wants the needle D?
Shelly wants some.
Anyone want a needle D?
Anybody?
So where do we jab him in the chest? You wanna shove big 4T gauge IV in his chest, where do we put it? It's left side, right?
So it would be between 3 and 4.
So yeah, so your chest tube would be between 5 and 6 on the anterior axillary line, and that's an alternate site for needle D. And actually, there's some evidence to suggest that you should probably start doing needle Ds there. But we actually still teach just above the third rib on the mid-clavicular line, so about right here, right, or straight down into the lungs. Okay. So find the clavicle space 2 space, and you're going to go right above the third rib, not below the second rib, right? The vasculature and nerve bundles run under the rib, so you want to go over the third rib, not under the second rib. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got clavicle space, that's 2, space 3, so it's going to be right in that space there. Now remember, you're going in parallel to the chest wall, not parallel to the bed. So you can miss the entire lung if you go parallel to the bed and go right over top of it. So remember, it's parallel to the chest wall, so it's going to be slight angle to the bed. Now shove that baby straight in there. Hopefully you'll hear a whoosh of air if you do this on a real person. But either way, they should.
You gotta go further down there.
Immediately get better. Okay, so you got the needle in. Now we look at our vital signs. Look at that. How about that? Way to go, Stanley. How's your vent look, Shan?
Much better.
Much better, yeah.
Got rid of that high pressure. We fixed our shock state. Now, he probably needs a chest tube now, right? But we bought ourselves a good bit of time. He's still got a pneumo,
Right.
but we let that pressure off, which was going to kill him. So now we can take some time. And now, if we're on a longer transport or something for you all, we may have to needle D him more than once. So he may end up rebuilding that pressure, or having to put a pigtail catheter in or something to help keep him from building that pressure.
So it's not something that you would leave in per se?
Well, you can leave the catheter in, but the problem with the catheter is those 14 gauge catheters, when the lung rate expands, they'll kink it.
Okay.
So it may not be able to keep you can put a flutter valve on it, and you can leave the catheter in. But one of the problems with needle D is that it's only temporizing measure. Usually that catheter will get kinked as the lung reinflates.
Okay.
So you really need a chest tube or even a pigtail catheter. If it's purely just a tension pneumo and not the hemopneumo, a pigtail catheter would probably work too.
Okay.
Great. Let's pull that out. I'll take that needle back from you. Thank you. All right, so y'all don't have a chest X-ray. You don't have an X-ray machine in your ambulance, do you? So what's another way?
Stop the scan. That's what we're
So interestingly enough, we really poor data on finding pneumos with stethoscopes.
Huh.
Yeah, we're not that good at it. Part of that is that you have this hyperresonant area of compressed air that actually will transmit lung sounds from the other side. That's part of it. Part of it is that we suck in the single lung sound. We're just not that good at it, truly, across the board, and that's everybody. We're just not that great at listening to lung sounds. Have you ever gotten report from, watched somebody get report or whatever, and they're told, oh, the patient's got crackles, and then for 3 or 4 days the patient's going to have crackles regardless of what he's got, because that was what everybody was telling each other, right? And we hear what we want to hear oftentimes with these lung sounds, and we're not that great at it actually. So what's another way we can do that other than chest X-ray?
Outpatient.
Yeah, so hyperresonance, you might be able to hear that.
And NICU sometimes they use lights.
Yeah, oh yeah, NICU, yeah, with those little translucent babies, they're easy to see, right? So for you all, point of care ultrasound's a nice tool too. So let's talk about that. So we can actually ultrasound this guy's lungs and look at it that way. So pull this up here. So here is, can you flip the lights off for me? So this is a normal lung. So this is a probe that's looking straight down, and you see here a cross section of 2 circular ribs. Okay? In this area here, that's the intercostal muscles in between the ribs. And you see this line moving, that's the pleura. So you're seeing the lung tissue slide. This is called pleural sliding, and you're seeing it slide across the parietal visceral pleural sliding back and forth. That makes sense? So this is normal lung. This is Stanley's right. So now let's contrast that with absent sliding. So we look at both lungs. Here, there's a rib. There's a rib. Here's the pleura, or what should be the pleura. Nothing. See how there's no sliding? This is a pneumo. No listening required. This is actually far more accurate both for ET tube placement and for diagnosing a dropped lung than auscultation. So how do you know if your ET tube's in the right place? Well, we can listen to it. Did you know there's a study that suggests that anesthesiologists can only hear right main stem tube placement with 65% accuracy? In anesthesia. It's not like someday they work on cars. That's all they do is place tubes all day. If they can only diagnose the right main stem tube 65% of the time, I don't like my odds. Right? Point of care ultrasound made that 98%. So we can look pleural sliding on both sides, the tube's in the right place. No, I know it's not even in the right main stem. Not only is it in the trachea, I know it's in the trachea, not even in the main stem. Okay. Same thing with pneumos. I don't need that chest x-ray. I can do this in the back of an ambulance, do this in the ED faster than I get a chest x-ray. Take a look, got pleural sliding, good, ruled out 2 pneumos. Or at least big pneumos. He may still have a small pneumo somewhere, but I ruled out the ones that will kill it. Right? So this is a really easy, fast tool. So that's another way that we can look at it. All right. I think we got to the end there. We get to the answers? Do you all have any questions for me?
Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, my contact slide will be at the end of this video.
Steps: promoting patient safety, improving health.